The old man in the hospital bed looked up at Alex with recognition and fear. "You're David's son," he whispered. Alex's fist clenched. This was the man his father blamed for everything. But what the dying veteran said next shattered everything Alex thought he knew about that day in Afghanistan. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of it. The weight of 20 years Alex Mitchell had carried his father's rage for 18 years. Every story, every drunken rant, every sleepless night when David Mitchell would pace the living room cursing a name: Sergeant Williams. The man who had betrayed his unit. The coward who had gotten good soldiers killed. The reason his father came home broken. Now, standing in room 314 of the VA hospital, Alex was face to face with that name. The man in the bed was thin, frail, connected to machines that beeped steadily in the sterile air. But his eyes were alert, sharp, and filled with something Alex hadn't expected to see: guilt. "I've been waiting for this day," Sergeant Williams said, his voice barely above a whisper. 20 years, and I always wondered if David would tell you the truth." "The truth?" Alex's voice was cold, controlled. "I know the truth. You left my father's squad to die. You ran when they needed you most." Williams closed his eyes, and for a moment, Alex thought the conversation was over. But when the old soldier opened them again, there were tears. "Is that what he told you? That's what happened?" "No, son. That's what your father needed to believe happened." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Alex had come here for one reason: to confront the man who had destroyed his father's life. He'd prepared himself for denials, for excuses, for the desperate lies of a dying coward. He hadn't prepared himself for this quiet certainty, this calm acceptance that suggested something far more complex than the simple story of betrayal he'd grown up believing. The hospital visit 3 days earlier, Alex had received a call from the VA hospital. Sergeant James Williams was dying, and he'd been asking for anyone from David Mitchell's family. The nurse explained that Williams had been trying to reach out for years, but David Mitchell had made it clear he wanted no contact. "He says he has something important to tell someone from your family," the nurse had said. "He doesn't have much time left." Alex had hung up without answering. His father had died 2 years ago, taking his anger and his pain with him. The last thing Alex wanted was to hear excuses from the man who had caused all that suffering. But something had nagged at him, some instinct he couldn't quite identify. 3 days later, he'd driven to the hospital. Now, looking at the dying man, Alex felt the familiar anger rise in his chest. This was the man his father had blamed for everything. The nightmares, the drinking, the rage that had poisoned their family for 20 years. "You want to know what really happened that day in Helmand province?" Williams asked. "I already know what happened." "No, you know what your father told you. And your father told you what he needed to believe to survive." Williams struggled to sit up in bed, his face contorting with pain. "Your father was a good soldier, Alex. One of the best I ever served with. But that day..." He paused, catching his breath. "That day broke something inside him that never healed right." "Stop." Alex's voice was sharp. "I didn't come here to listen to you make excuses. I'm not making excuses, son. I'm trying to give you the truth your father couldn't handle." Alex turned toward the door, but William's next words stopped him cold. "Your father didn't freeze under fire that day. He saved my life. Twice." The story nobody told Alex slowly turned back to face the dying man. "What did you say?" "Sit down, Alex. Please. This story's been eating at me for 20 years, and I ain't got much time left to tell it right." Against his better judgment, Alex found himself pulling up the visitor's chair. Williams reached toward the bedside table with a shaking hand and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a group of young soldiers in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. "That's your dad." Williams pointed to a lean young man with kind eyes. "And that's me next to him. We were tight, Alex. Brothers. Your father was my best friend." Alex stared at the photo. His father had never shown him any pictures from his deployment. He'd claimed they were all destroyed, too painful to keep. October 15th, 2004, Williams continued. Routine patrol in Helmand province. Supposed to be a milk run. Check on a village, show the flag, come home for chow. But intel was wrong. Taliban had been setting up for days. Williams closed his eyes, and Alex could see him traveling back 20 years, to a desert half a world away. We walked right into it. Soon as we got to the village square, the shooting started. RPGs, AK fire, the whole 9 yards. We took cover behind a burned-out truck, but we were pinned down good. Radio was dead, and we had wounded. My father said you abandoned your position, Alex said quietly. Your father said a lot of things that weren't true. Williams opened his eyes and looked directly at Alex. I left my position, yeah, but not to run. To save Private Johnson, who was bleeding out in the middle of that square. Your dad laid down covering fire while I dragged Johnson to safety. First time he saved my life. Alex felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the certainty he'd carried for so long. But that wasn't the worst of it, Williams continued. After I got Johnson to cover, we saw movement in the buildings around us. Taliban fighters, getting ready to flank us. If they got position, we were all dead. Somebody had to take out that machine gun nest in the second-story window across the square. And I volunteered. It was a suicide mission, plain and simple. But somebody had to do it, and I was the best shot we had. Your father knew it was a one-way trip. William's voice broke. He begged me not to go. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that thumbs up button. You can help more people hear this story by liking this video. Every week we share unforgettable stories of silent heroes. The truth that destroyed everything. But I went anyway, Williams continued, his breathing becoming more labored. Made it maybe 50 yards before I took a round in the leg, another in the shoulder. I was down bleeding, and those Taliban fighters were moving in for the kill. Alex leaned forward despite himself, drawn into the story. That's when your father did the most courageous thing I've ever seen. He left cover, ran through enemy fire, and dragged me back to safety. Second time he saved my life. Got me back to the truck, started working on my wounds. So what happened? Why did my father blame you for everything? Williams was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. Because while he was saving me, Private Johnson died. The words hit Alex like a physical blow. He suddenly understood the weight his father had carried, the impossible choice he'd been forced to make. Johnson was 19 years old, Williams continued. Kid from Ohio, just wanted to serve his country and go home to his girlfriend. While your father was pulling me to safety, Johnson bled out behind that truck. Your dad heard him calling for help, calling for his mama. Alex felt tears he hadn't expected burning behind his eyes. When the cavalry finally showed up and we got evacuated, your father couldn't handle it. In his mind, he'd chosen to save the wrong man. He'd let a kid die to save his best friend, and that choice broke something inside him that never healed. But it wasn't your fault, Alex said, the words coming out automatically. Try telling that to a man who's got survivor's guilt eating him alive, Williams replied. Your father needed someone to blame, and I was right there. It was easier for him to hate me than to hate himself. Why didn't you tell him the truth? I tried. God knows I tried. But every time I reached out, he'd hang up on me. Every letter I sent came back unopened. Eventually, I realized that my friendship, my forgiveness, it was just making things worse for him. So I stayed away. Alex stared at the photograph in his hands, seeing his father's young face in a completely different light. He spent 20 years hating you, and I spent 20 years letting him. Because if hating me helped him sleep at night, if it gave him someone to blame besides himself, then that was a burden I could carry. Williams reached out and touched Alex's hand with fingers that felt like paper. But I couldn't let you carry it too. That's why I asked you to come. You got a right to know your father was a hero. The weight of survivor's guilt over the next hour, Williams told Alex stories his father had never shared. Stories of courage, of brotherhood, of young men doing impossible things in impossible circumstances. He told him about David Mitchell's dry sense of humor, his loyalty to his squad, his skill as a soldier. Your dad wrote letters home every day, Williams said. Talked about you constantly, even though you weren't born yet. He couldn't wait to be a father. But he was never the same when he came home, Alex said. War changes people, son. Some folks come back and find a way to make peace with what they've seen. Others, Williams shook his head. Others get stuck in those moments when they had to choose between bad and worse. He drank, Alex said quietly. Every night. And he'd talk about Johnson, about failing his men. The kid from Ohio. Yeah, he'd cry sometimes when he thought I was asleep. Say he should have saved Johnson instead. Williams nodded sadly. That's survivor's guilt talking. Your father saved every man he could that day. Me, Rodriguez, Patterson, Thompson. We all came home because of David Mitchell. But in his mind, the one he couldn't save was the only one that mattered. Alex looked at the photograph again. trying to reconcile this heroic figure with the broken man who'd raised him. Why didn't anyone tell him he was a hero? We tried. The army gave him a bronze star for valor. His commanding officer recommended him for a silver star. But your father, he couldn't see past that one moment when he had to choose. And you let him blame you all these years. Some burdens are easier to carry when you're carrying them for someone you love, Williams said simply. The final truth as visiting hours drew to a close, Williams reached into his bedside drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "This is for you," he said, pressing it into Alex's hands. "Your father wrote it the night before we shipped home. He wanted me to give it to his family if something happened to him. I've been carrying it for 20 years. Alex looked at the envelope, his name written in his father's young handwriting. He wrote this before everything went wrong, before Johnson died, before the guilt set in. This is your father as he really was, not the broken man the war made him." Alex carefully opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was long, filled with hopes and dreams, expressions of love for a son he'd never met, promises about the kind of father he wanted to be. It was written by a man who believed in himself, who had purpose and joy and plans for the future. At the bottom, in a different handwriting, was a note. "Alex, if you're reading this, it means James Williams kept his word. Your father was the best man I ever knew. Don't let his pain make you forget his courage. Sergeant Williams. You wrote this the night your father died. I heard about it in the obituary. Figured someday you might want to know who he really was." Alex folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. "I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just remember that your father was a hero who saved lives. And remember that some stories are too heavy for one person to carry alone." The healing begins. Alex drove home in silence, his mind reeling from everything he'd learned. The anger he'd carried for 18 years was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer directed at Williams, but at the war itself, at the impossible choices it forced good men to make, at the guilt that had poisoned his father's life. When he got home, he sat at his kitchen table and read his father's letter again. Then he pulled out his laptop and began writing his own letter to Williams, thanking him for carrying his father's burden, for protecting his memory, for giving Alex the truth he'd needed to hear. But when he tried to send it the next morning, he received an automatic reply from the hospital. Sergeant James Williams had died peacefully in his sleep. Alex never got to thank the man who'd spent 20 years protecting his father's legacy. But he carried Williams' final gift with him, the knowledge that his father had been a hero, and that some acts of love are so profound they span decades. The legacy continues years later. Alex would tell his own children about their grandfather. Not the broken veteran who'd struggled with alcohol and rage, but the young soldier who'd run through enemy fire to save his best friend, who'd carried the weight of impossible choices, who'd been a hero even when he couldn't see it himself. And, sometimes, when his kids asked about war and sacrifice and the price of service, Alex would tell them about Sergeant Williams too, the man who'd loved his friend enough to carry his guilt, to bear his anger, to protect his memory even, when it meant living with 20 years of undeserved blame. Because some stories, Alex learned, are too important to stay buried. And some heroes are too valuable to forget, even when they can't see their own worth. The truth had taken 20 years to surface, but it had finally set them all free. In the end, Alex realized, both his father and Williams had been heroes. One had saved lives on a battlefield, and the other had saved a soul by carrying its burden. Both acts of courage were equally profound, equally necessary, equally worthy of honor. The war was over, but the healing had just begun.